Mm.
Does that include speakers?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Hello, everyone. We're on the line. We're just going to wait a few minutes for more people to join. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Investor Alliance webinar on banks and human rights. My name is Paloma Munoz and I'm the Program Director of the Investor Alliance. This webinar is part of our campaign on financial institutions, which seeks to promote the uptake of human rights due diligence in line with the UN Guiding Principles by banks. The objective of today's call is to start a discussion on the main trends, challenges, and opportunities associated to addressing the human rights impacts of banks. So today, we have the pleasure of having David Kovick with us. David is Senior Advisor with Shift, where he works across all areas of Shift's work, which includes building understanding and support for the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights across a number of sectors. David has advised, trained, and supported a range of private and public financial institutions, including private banks, development finance institutions, export credit agencies, and investors to strengthen their existing environmental and social due diligence frameworks to better align with the expectations of the guiding principles. David serves as an in-house expert at Shift on training design, facilitation, stakeholder engagement, and grievance mechanisms. David is also a graduate of Stanford Law School and Duke University. For those of you who are less familiar with the organization, Shift is a leading center of expertise on the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights. The global team at Shift facilitates dialogues, builds capacity, and develops new approaches with companies, governments, civil society organizations, and international institutions to promote business respect for human rights. David will, of course, tell us a little bit more about Shift's work later on in the call. Also on the call today, we have Lauren Compere, Managing Director and the Director of Shareholder Advocacy at Boston Common Asset Management. Lauren will start us off today and share with us the state of play in terms of investor engagement with banks and human rights, while Michelle de Cordova, Director and Corporate Engagement of Public Policy and the NII Investment, will be our kickoff discussant after David presents his work and his views and information with us on human rights and banks. So Michelle will help to frame how investors can use the information that David has shared with us in our engagements moving forward. After Michelle speaks with us, we will open it up to questions and comments from other participants. I just want to alert everyone to the chat box and the question box actually on the right-hand side of your screen, where you're able to insert questions for different speakers. So at least they'll be registered there. And once we open it up for discussion, we'll be able to ask those questions accordingly. So I think with that, I will ask Lauren to take it away.
Great, thanks, Paloma. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay,
sounds good.
All right, great. So I wanted to kick off by just saying that we think here at Boston Common that is actually really essential for investors to engage not only individual banks and their portfolios, but also the frameworks and the guidance that are coming out from groups like the OECD and the Equator Principles Association. And so I, over the last even just 6 months, have been in the offices of probably half a dozen banks where we've not only spoken about climate change, but also human rights. And we think that's really important because in the case, because, you know, of the reputational risk, but also the financial risk potentially and regulatory risk. I think if you want to look at where the center of gravity is, though, in terms of leading practice, I would say you'd have to really look at the Dutch banks. And so in particular, when I was in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago, we had a chance to sit down with ING to really get a sense of where they were moving with integrating and aligning with the UN Guiding Principles and, you know, their work around salience and how they were sort of integrating human rights due diligence across business lines. And I think that's really important to sort of highlight the Dutch experience, and maybe David's going to speak a little bit more about that, because the Dutch banking covenant has actually required transparency around the way in which banks are looking at these issues. There is a group of banks in particular that are looking at value chains, whole supply chains, cocoa, palm, and gold, I believe. And they've already issued some guidance on cocoa. We think that what's happening in the Netherlands can be a reflection of what you know, their peers here in the U.S. and globally should be emulating. The other thing I'll just say really quickly is that, you know, human rights in many ways is conversation, and so from a practical standpoint, using things like pipeline projects in the U.S. and indigenous peoples that NEI and Boston Common have been leading, you know, engaging on the reputational risks, the environmental and social governance risks around those pipeline projects is a nice sort of segue into making reputational risk and potential regulatory reform a very practical conversation with the banks you're investing in. Another issue that we've actually brought in, we've woven in into some of our recent dialogues with some of the U.S. and global banks like Barclays and Standard Chartered. We have brought in DAPL, the Go to Access Pipeline, as a case study for what went wrong and what needs to be enhanced. And then finally, I'll just say that we've also brought in the issue of gun violence and how banks are looking at not only investing but also lending to some of the gun manufacturers. One last point I would say is that it's really critically important to engage directly in the OECD consultation that's happening right now around bank lending practices and human rights due diligence, as well as the reform and the Equator Principles Association guidance for, I think, over 90 banks that implement this in project finance. And one of the key areas we're focused on, along with NEI, is the whole idea of not having country designation for implementation of the Equator Principles Association due diligence and required consultations, for example, with key stakeholders and impacted communities. There's a formal process happening right now. The Equator Principle has an association. We've written a letter. There's an investor statement that is out there as well, providing guidance to what investors expect of not only the EP Association, but the banks that then adhere to their framework. I think I'll stop there. Hopefully some of that was helpful in framing the conversation.
Sure. Thanks so much, Lauren. Very helpful for framing. So David, over to you. You know, we're certainly interested in knowing a little bit about why Shift has decided to work on financial institutions and banks in particular. So very interested to hear a little bit about the work that you have done in that area. A couple of other questions that I think would be very helpful for us to ask you include, so based on your experience, to what extent have banks actually adopted and implemented human rights due diligence, meaningful human rights due diligence? And what are the challenges that you're seeing in terms of your engagements with bank on due diligence? And on the same sort of, as a result of that, curious to know what you think investors should do, or could do at least, to play a role in addressing the challenges that you're coming across. And then finally, curious to know if there are any tools or guidance that Shift has developed or will be developing that could support investors in their efforts to promote respect for human rights by banks. So yeah, with that, please, let us know, and curious to hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Paloma and Lauren, for the introduction and the opportunity. The answer to that first question of why are we focusing on a lot of our attention on working with banks, it's also the answer to the question, why am I pleased to be able to speak to you, which is we recognize the amount of leverage that what happens inside a company when an investor like Lauren shows up at a headquarters and starts asking questions about human rights. The same is true when a bank starts asking questions about human rights from the companies that they invest in. And so it's really a great opportunity, pleasure to be talking with you, because it really fits into what I think Shift is trying to do as a very small organization in terms of the number of people we have, but trying to really maximize our impact, which is look for others who can really raise the profile of these issues in the places that they need to be raised. So just a quick word about Shift. Paloma gave the introduction. We really are grounded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. My colleagues helped to write them. We're chaired by the principal author, John Ruggie. And for the last 7 years, that's been what we've done, is really tried to help businesses, governments, and other stakeholders, financial institutions and investors, international organizations, understand what it means, but equally explore together what it means to put these principles into practice. It is not always self-evident. This is the space of dilemmas and challenge, and what does it mean for a bank with 15,000 corporate clients to conduct human rights due diligence, to be able to meet those principles. So this really is it's not that there's a template of this is what everyone needs to do. There's a set of core principles, and we're trying to work together with others to figure out exactly, well, what does it mean to put this into practice in the right way? And that really ties to what we're trying to do with our theory of change, which is to understand, explore, and then push leading practice with individual engagements, but then move markets by looking at those actors who can shape the actions of others, the industry standards and leading frameworks that can take what we've learned, the insights we've gained through individual engagements, and leverage those to become what industry simply does. If you want to advance the slide, Mary, so that's why we focus on the financial sector, is because of the leverage that we think financial institutions can have in changing business practice. Financial institutions, including investors, but banks as well, are connected to so many of the potential human rights impacts on people that come from business activity anywhere in the world. And when a financial institution, a bank or investor, raise a question to a company, it's treated differently than when a civil society actor raises the question or a business partner raises the question. They're all different points of leverage. So we're looking across the board, but I think we've seen and heard from our business partners how valuable it is when a financial institution asks that question, because it engages different parts of the business in the conversation. It's no longer just a sustainability question. It's now an investor relations question. It's now a lender question. And so it gets to a different part of the organization. We do focus on both public and private financial institutions, so development finance institutions, export credit agencies, private banks, investors, really looking at the broader financial landscape. In the private side, just so you understand who we've worked with, ABN AMRO, Citi, Wells Fargo, ING, and Westpac in the private banking side. part of why I highlight that is it is a very small number of banks still. And that is one of the biggest challenges for this space. We engage with lots of other banks through other engagements like the Dutch Banking Covenant Agreement, like our work with the Equator Principles Association or the IFC Performance Standards or the OECD Financial Sector Advisory Group. So it's grounded in more, but part of my point is when we get to what we're seeing in terms of what banks are doing already, and do you want to advance the slide, Mary? I think one of the biggest notes about this is that this is still a fairly, sorry, Mary, if you can go back one. It's still a fairly high level conversation that's happening among a very small number of banks. And so that's one of the big challenges. But in terms of what we already see in this space, typically, I think to start with, we have both an advantage and a disadvantage because banks already recognize the importance of environmental and social risks and managing those and recognizing some form of responsibility for addressing impacts that they might be connected to through clients and other business partners. And so that's a great place to start. And they have these environmental and social risk management frameworks in place. Those can get you a long way when they're implemented well, but they also create a challenge, which is often banks think they've already got it figured out, and really helping them to understand what's different here in terms of where you're focusing and what you're being asked to do and what the nature of the responsibility is. So it's both an advantage and a challenge in that sense. But we're starting across the board, again, varying levels of practice in terms of managing environmental and social risk, but there is that understanding. That's an industry standard of we manage environmental and social risk that we could be connected to through our clients. How we do that, lots of open questions. In terms of human rights, all I can really say is that I think there's now a recognized need to recognize human rights. And so we're seeing more human rights policies. We're seeing the words human rights thrown around more, but I think very large questions about do the banks themselves understand the implications of these terms, of the guiding principles on practice, and what it means for implementation of their existing ESRM frameworks, rather than simply adding the words human rights. That's not what this space is about. The framework that we work with, the guiding principles, isn't about making sure the words human rights are here and there. Rather, it's an approach to managing those issues and an understanding of what's expected that really needs to infuse these approaches. So that's what we're working on all the time. In terms of some just pockets of emerging leadership, what are we seeing? Some banks are starting to explore the coverage of their environmental and social risk management frameworks. Many of these are limited to, just a very small number of transactions that the bank has overall. If it's an extractives client or project, we do this due diligence. If there are land acquisition involved or indigenous peoples involved, we do this due diligence. But a whole range of other relationships and transactions that are never coming to the attention of the people in the bank who are tasked with both managing these potential impacts, but also protecting the reputation of the bank from being connected to these impacts. So the point here is a huge number of blind spots. It's not that they picked bad areas to focus on. It's just the exposure to potential human rights risk is so much greater. And so what we're starting to see is more thoughtful approaches to more comprehensive criteria for where we focus. This is a challenging space because the tools aren't yet there, but I can say more about that in a second. We are seeing interesting examples in a very small way of leverage in practice. So if we look at, the ways in which some banks sought to use their influence, their leverage when they were connected to the Dakota Access Pipeline project, it creates at least a recognition that this isn't just about putting things in contracts. This is about going beyond that and looking at all the things the bank could do to influence practice in this instance and create expectations for practice in the future. And so I think that starts to create the foundation for a more interesting conversation about what all banks should be doing, how robust the toolkit is for banks to influence the behaviors of clients. I think we are starting to see improved reporting with the human rights lens. Again, very small here, but we now have a framework, the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework. Many investors on this call are actively promoting and using this framework in conversations with your clients, your portfolio companies. We're starting to see banks using it. Things like the Dutch banking agreement are actually helping. It's the primary reason that ING is doing a human rights report coming out later this year, is because that they committed to do so under the Dutch banking agreement, which was a multi-stakeholder collaboration to say, what do we as a society expect of our banks in respecting these issues? One of the reasons why I think Lauren was highlighting that is that it is different in kind from a lot of the other activities we see in industry, where it is really industry versus industry alone, banks deciding for themselves what this means. It's really sitting down with stakeholders and trying to unpack the expectations in practice. I think one of the areas that we're always very interested in is when these issues become something that the bank as a whole is managing, and not just the sustainability team or the environmental and social team. And so ABN AMRO, for instance, ING as well, doing some interesting engagement with the business itself. And so how do we help equip the business to recognize these kinds of risks early in the relationships, to be able to have conversations with clients about these kinds of risks, to have the right lens, because they are the primary point of contact. And so when we see banks undertaking activities that really bring these issues into the business, that is more exciting. And then Lauren mentioned the value chain analysis. In terms of a tool for leverage, what is it that banks who want to be more serious about this and play a role can do? We're just seeing this very interesting approach of banks in the Netherlands, starting with an ABN AMRO process around the diamond value chain, but then they brought that into this collaborative approach where all the banks are sitting down with stakeholders and saying, let's identify some specific value chains, some specific commodities, and let's recognize that we're connected to only small pieces of this, but that the risks may be somewhere else in this value chain, and that's the risk we want to manage. So how can we build a collaborative understanding of what this value chain looks like and where we should be focusing our efforts if we wanted to manage the most severe risks? And they're starting to put these out into the public domain. And the real value is it creates a platform for a conversation that brings lots of stakeholders together to align around a shared understanding of a problem and a shared understanding of solutions that might help. And making that as transparent as possible and allowing for stakeholders to then collaborate on those solutions. So it's one of the areas I think we're excited about that. The challenges, if you want to advance the slide, Mary, that we typically see with a bank, I would put them in twofold: the practices that we see and the broader context. And you'll recognize these from what I saw with leading practice, which were practices to start to address these challenges, which is scale. That's the first one. Where should a bank focus across a portfolio of 15,000 corporate clients? Where should they focus their due diligence efforts? We know the criteria is they should focus on where the most severe harm to people is. How do they do that when they are connected to almost every sector in the world, and therefore almost every impact in the world? What criteria should they use? And then one of the real challenges is that those tools don't yet exist. The types of rating services that banks use, and investors as well, still aren't very good at recognizing or capturing or flagging human rights risk and human rights performance. It's something that Shift is now working on in collaboration with others. But for now, for a bank to say, I've got 15,000 clients, where do I focus? It's a challenge to figure out in practice, what does that system look like? We can help them with the criteria, but now where do I get the information to do that in practice? That doesn't mean they shouldn't try. It doesn't mean they can't do better than they're currently doing. It's just to recognize that it's not a simple fix. The second is leverage, moving beyond contract clauses into more robust understanding of the kinds of things a bank could do. Now, to do that, you have to be able to prioritize up front, because you can't do that in every relationship. One of the areas that I think we're particularly interested in and excited about is the area of remedy. There's a big political, I would say, a maelstrom, a controversy, a discussion that is not particularly constructive in the international community that many banks are leading around defining the limits of their responsibility more narrowly. And part of the reason is that stakeholders are saying, when bad things happen, you need to fix the problem. And you need to pay for it because the people, your clients, aren't. And we need to find a way to bring remedy to people on the ground who get hurt. And one of the big reasons this is all of this is happening is because banks aren't doing enough to encourage their clients and their business partners to provide remedy when impacts occur. So it may not be the bank's responsibility to actually fix the problem. They may be responsible for using their leverage, but they're not using their leverage effectively enough to get those who are causing the harm to fix it. And so we're thinking about this idea of, what typically happens is stakeholders ask banks to create a grievance mechanism. And that's important. But for the most part, that is not going to actually bring remedy on the ground, because a grievance mechanism at a bank level may not have the capability of providing that remedy if their clients aren't engaged, if their clients' business partners aren't engaged. So we're trying to think more creatively about the many roles that banks need to play in a remedy ecosystem, which is the idea that they have roles to play at their own level, they have roles to play at the client level, they can use their leverage in different ways to ensure that the business partners, the clients, the projects, the activities are prepared for the potential of impacts and can provide remedy. And then when they do occur, banks are using their leverage effectively to make sure business partners are living up to those commitments. The other challenge in practice, I think, is disclosure. The financial sector is notorious for, protecting confidentiality at the expense of transparency. And I think we need to, sorry, the slide, I didn't notice that it's a duplicate, so I'll just speak to it. I think there has been a default position of banks to say less rather than more. And in the field of business and human rights, transparency is the number one tool for accountability. And so helping banks understand the expectations for what they should be saying publicly about their approach to human rights so that stakeholders can hold them accountable. It's a real challenge of hiding behind client confidentiality, and I think the ingrained culture of banks and the financial sector. In the broader context, challenges are, the fact that the notion of responsibility under the guiding principles is being attacked by some banks, and it's less constructive. Lauren mentioned the OECD conversations around defining bank approaches to due diligence, what's expected, setting expectations. There's actually a consultation taking place today in London. And this whole process is really, become a bit of a political fight over these things rather than actually a meaningful conversation about, but what should banks be doing in practice? And then the other challenge is just we're at the tip of the iceberg. It's still very limited penetration across the industry. And so one of the things that we at Shift are always looking to do is find ways to engage new audiences in the financial sector in this conversation beyond the usual suspects. If you want to advance the slide, Mary. And so, that's where we're headed, which is looking for ways to bring new players into the conversation. And so whether that is our work with the Equator Principles Association, where instead of talking to 5 Dutch banks, we're talking to 90 global banks. If it's the United Nations Environmental Program has a financial institutions program, and they're looking to develop principles for sustainable banking. And, if it's engaging there in order to reach more Southern banks to bring them into the conversation, that's a part of what we're looking to do. In terms of what investors can do, I think, Lauren and Michelle have been very engaged in these conversations already. And Lauren flagged some of these. There is a conversation at the OECD level right now about what is expected of banks. I am concerned about whether or not that conversation can get to a more constructive place. Regardless, the voice of investors who see a need for banks to act responsibly in this space is really important. And we've been working with some of you to create opportunities for you to join those conversations. But even if you're not joining the advisory board in an official capacity, making sure the investor voice is heard to say, we want to make sure banks are aligning with these expectations. And we want to make sure the OECD guidance, any guidance that's put out, is aligned with those expectations. The Equator Principles review is happening next month in October. The Equator Principles Association asked us for some advice at Shift about what are the areas that they need to focus on to create greater alignment. and we gave them some very straightforward advice that they have taken. I won't say they've taken it on board. I don't know the extent to which they will, but there are some significant gaps in alignment and some significant gaps in practice. Part of what we are interested in that conversation is not what happens in this particular review, although it is certainly important, where they're going to deal with this question of where do the Equator Principles apply, just in developing markets or all across the world. And we think it's very important that they apply everywhere. That's consistent with an approach to human rights that says, even in the United States, you can have significant impacts on people, even where you follow the law, just as Dakota Access highlighted. The other thing that they're looking at is the rules around indigenous peoples. And so you can see how that one project is really driving the conversation. Part of what we're excited about is what happens next. This review is important, but the next review is equally important. And so what we think we've done is tee up some ideas that we hope they take forward in the coming year, which may need further exploration, including ideas around remedy. But I think it's really important for banks to hear from their investors about the Equator Principles review and how the investors are looking at this. And again, I don't need to be the one to say what messaging that is, because that, I think many of you on this call have already been a part of creating that messaging. Continuing with the individual engagement with banks and just putting the framing of the UNGPs, asking the questions of banks about in what ways has your environmental and social risk management brought in the lens of the guiding principles. That question alone can trigger all kinds of activity and further questions by the bank about how to answer that question. And so I think every question an investor asks has ripple effects in that individual bank and then across the industry. So I think continuing to do that. And then again, I think there are these other standard setting processes that we're still exploring. The reason the Sustainable Banking Initiative is somewhat interesting is all of the standards that exist are around project finance, yet that is a very small piece of what banks do. And the much broader space is their broader corporate lending relationships. And there are currently no standards in place for that. That's part of what the Dutch Banking Agreement was looking at, that we were participating in. It's part of what the OECD is looking at. And this UNFFI approach initiative is intending to look at that as well. Although we are, not confident that they've really understood what the human rights lens means there. Just in terms of where we're headed as Shift, on the next slide, we've been playing around in this space for a while, and I think we've recognized that we now have some things to say about it. And so that's where we want to go in the coming months, is really helping to shape some conversations through some public outputs about how banks can think about this challenge of scale and prioritization, what they can be thinking about in terms of more robust approaches to leverage, and how to reshape the conversation around remedy, which we think can unlock other conversations as well. And then, as I said, just constantly looking for opportunities to engage the mainstream industry. I just wanted to, I'm just back from Finland yesterday, actually, where I was all week. And there I was working with public sector financial instruments that the government finances. And I just think there's an interesting conversation there that is relevant to the broader context here, which is there the conversation is really about development impact and trying to bring a human rights lens to that. And so we're into the space of the Sustainable Development Goals and the SDGs and what, how that connects to human rights. And that's an area that Shift has been thinking a lot about, because the risk is that in thinking about the SDGs, companies start thinking about how they can have positive impacts on society without continuing to consider or starting to consider the negative impacts they could have. And so I'm guessing, and the SDGs are fun to talk about because as a business, it's great to talk about the story of how you're contributing to global social development. And again, the risk is that we have companies just start picking different SDGs that they want to contribute to and not talking about the core responsibility of the business. And so we've just done some work to try to help shape how those conversations can take place around the SDGs in ways that tie it to the core responsibility to respect human rights, and how you can use the lens of human rights to actually drive much greater contributions to the SDGs. So I just wanted to highlight that these aren't different frameworks. They are very much connected, and helping, if a company or a bank wants to talk about the SDGs, fantastic. How can we, as investors, use our leverage to make sure that they are bringing that human rights lens to leverage their SDGs work as well. So that's just one of the other areas that's become much more prevalent, particularly where the SDGs are the language of the day. So that's a little bit about where we've been to, what we're seeing, where we're going. I'm going to stop and listen to Michelle, offer some thoughts, and then very happy to talk through any of these issues or others that are on your mind.
Thanks so much, David. That was incredibly helpful to really lay the groundwork and what's going on in terms of the main challenges in particular, but also opportunities for investors when it comes to our efforts to address some of those challenges. And I think I just wanted to add one thing before handing it over to Michelle, and that is that next Thursday, we're actually going to be hosting a session that's going to be led by Caroline Reese, who is the executive director of SHIFT, at ICCR during ICCR's conference, specifically on the SDGs and how human rights due diligence is really key when it comes to how companies need to understand their role and their contribution to the SDGs. So we'll actually be diving deep into that next week for those of you who will be in New York for that session. So with that, Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Paloma, and thank you, David. That was a really, I think, really helpful overview of what is happening in this space. I wanted to take the advantage of being asked to speak to ask David a couple, maybe one or two questions. But first, I wanted to really just reiterate something that Lauren was brought up at the start, and that David touched upon as well, which is that there really are some great opportunities for our coalition to input into the policy aspects of responsible banking over the next 6 months or so, like opportunities that do not come up very often. Just thinking about what the timeline for that might be, the OECD banks due diligence guidance, which, as David says, is under discussion in London today. We are looking at ways that we could provide further input to that process, and that would need to take place probably in the next few weeks, given the timeline for the OECD to complete that paper. So there is one big opportunity there. The second opportunity that once again was touched upon was the Equator Principles update. Their annual meeting will be taking place in October, and then after that there will be an opportunity for public consultation on the draft of the update of the Equator Principles. I believe that will be out for comment in the spring of 2019. Once again, there's a great opportunity for us to bring an investor perspective to that consultation early next year. And then there is, of course, the opportunity to bring our insights relating to those policy frameworks into the conversations that all of us may be having with individual banks that are either members of the Equator Principles or would be covered by the OECD guidance, to encourage them towards progressive perspectives on those policy frameworks. So I think you will look out for opportunities coming up through this network over the coming months on those policy pieces. I wanted to, am I allowed to ask David a question?
Yes, certainly.
Oh, great. So, David, Could you talked about the Dutch banking agreement, which I think many of us who have looked into this issue find very interesting, very stimulating what's coming out of that Dutch agreement, and perhaps look at the markets that we focus on and don't see the same level of collaboration between banks within that market. Can you tell us anything about, maybe tell us a little bit more about how the Dutch banks got into that state of collaboration? And is there anything that we can learn from that might be useful for perhaps encouraging banks in different markets to collaborate on responsible lending issues?
Yeah, can I just add one note on that as well? David, are you seeing other industry collaborations where we could insert this dialogue? For example, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Banking Values here in the North America.
Yeah, thanks. So just a little bit about the Dutch banking agreement. So this is not just the Dutch approach is not limited to the financial sector. It's actually covering a broad range of sectors. So there's also an agreement among Dutch textiles companies and stakeholders, among now the pension funds and stakeholders, among coal producing companies, not with stakeholders in that case. That one was just with government. But across all sectors, I'll be going back in a couple of weeks doing one with renewable energy and looking at how do we as an industry look at our responsibility, and then by looking at it together, identify key minimum standards that we all commit to. How are we going to implement these expectations individually, but all commit to them and support each other in doing so, but then collaborate by identifying shared priorities or shared opportunities to build our leverage. And part of the context is, you know, the Dutch space has always been about this multi-stakeholder dialogue approach, and so it's rather ingrained that if we want to figure out a problem, we should be consulting these other stakeholders. It's not as foreign as it may be in other contexts. The other part of the context is that there was the potential threat of regulation, where government was, civil society was asking government, and some parts of government were saying, as we're seeing, you know, various trends around Europe in particular, but also Australia and elsewhere, the increasing legislative approaches to implementing the UNGPs and requiring companies to undertake due diligence, including banks and others. So the idea in the Netherlands was come together as an industry with stakeholders, do so credibly, and if that doesn't work, then there is the potential for regulation down the road. So it is in your best interest to self-regulate in that sense, and to self-regulate through collaboration. That's a little bit about how they got there, but there's also that cultural element of, well, that's how we solve any problem. In terms of lessons learned, I think, and opportunities to take the same kind of approach, I would just highlight what the value of this has been. It has been slow. It has been tedious. It has had to tackle some very fundamental challenges about understanding how what a bank's responsibility is for particular impacts, and how it should be engaging with clients around those, precisely because those issues are not settled in the international landscape. What's interesting about it is it's providing a different input into those international conversations because it is multi-stakeholder, because it is not just banks getting together and deciding what they think is appropriate, but banks and stakeholders deciding together. That's one of the really important values. The other is it's just fundamentally changed the way that these banks engage with their stakeholders and the stakeholders engage with their banks. So, I mean, I would say it's a mutually beneficial in the sense that through greater transparency, through greater time spent together talking about these issues, stakeholders have a better understanding of the limitations in practice that banks face. Banks have a better understanding of the expectations that society has and how to do this in a principled but pragmatic way. And when specific challenges now come up, there are different pathways for engaging each other around these issues that don't have to be quite as confrontational. And so that to me is the biggest outcome of this process, is it's just fundamentally changed the nature of the dialogue from one that was extremely confrontational to one that is diving into practice and limitations and opportunities in ways that we haven't seen elsewhere. So as far as what I could say as opportunities for others to have that kind of dialogue, I think it's important to flag for industry where they may not have the same kind of cultural expectation or regulatory pressure, although that may be coming, to recognize the business case for talking to stakeholders about these expectations, to recognize the opportunity that it can create for a bank in having this conversation with their social counterparts and changing the way they talk about these issues going forward. And I think that can be true in absolutely any context you see where society, where business is talking about sustainability issues or social expectations. You can bring this lens and you can bring this approach of involving stakeholder perspectives throughout that.
David, just a quick question for you. Are you one of the things you haven't really chimed in on are potential kind of challenges to this conversation. Do you still have concerns about the team group's kind of approach to banks and human rights due diligence and their role in respecting human rights in terms of direct connection versus influence? Did you want to maybe?
Yeah. So for those who may not be as familiar with the political landscape, a bunch of banks got together, led by a few banks who were really pushing back on this idea that banks should be responsible for impacts caused through client relationships in the same way that the guiding principles articulate. And they did so on their own, without stakeholder input, without anybody else involved. And there's nothing wrong with an industry getting together and saying, what does this mean for us? But they started putting out position papers that were really trying to articulate and define for the industry itself, this is what responsibility means for us. And so it is both a challenge for the financial sector, but it's also a challenge for the broader landscape where we have broad consensus about this framework of what businesses should be doing to respect human rights in practice. And then we have one industry saying for itself, that's nice, but we're going to limit it in the following way. And that's a really dangerous precedent, and it really challenges the fundamental landscape of consensus around these expectations. It's one of the reasons, and what they were trying to do is say that banks are different from everybody else. We are so far removed from some of these impacts that what we really need to do is define our responsibility based on what we have control over, what we can fix, and what we can't. And if it's far away from us, we should not have a responsibility to fix it. Whereas the guiding principles take a different approach. They say, if you're really far away, that's certainly a factor. But what the factor is that you have less leverage, maybe. It will change how you use your leverage, but you still have a responsibility to address it. I always use the example in trainings of the Norwegian pension fund, which is they're seen as something of a, or in some circles, a stamp of approval. If they're investing, it must be okay because of their ethical counsel, et cetera. So if they own one share, they may have extremely limited connection, and that's part of the conversation that was had back in earlier OECD conversations. But they actually have a tremendous amount of influence because of how they are seen in the marketplace. And so defining responsibility based on how much leverage you have is dangerous. Whereas defining what actions you can take based on how much leverage you have is perfectly appropriate. So I think what we're seeing now is that what happened was, I think the Thun Group was started as a constructive process to say, let's come together and figure it out for ourselves what we think this means. The problem was that it got positioned by some as this is the interpretation of the standard and it's now what the industry does, as opposed to the basis for a conversation with others about what it means in practice. And so now you have, the way I see it is you have the Thun Group position statements out there, which again, I think are very challenging from a UNGP's perspective and a process perspective and for all kinds of reasons, where they introduce new terms and new concepts that no one else has approved or agreed or said, yeah, we think that makes sense. You've got the Dutch banking process, which has tried to answer some of the same questions through a more multi-stakeholder approach. And now you have them at the OECD level trying to pass judgment in a multi-stakeholder way and articulate these expectations, but in a very politically charged atmosphere. And so I think it's important to recognize the role that these different conversations are playing and the danger that it can be posed when a bank says we're meeting our responsibility by sitting down with industry and figuring out for ourselves what it means to put this into practice. Does that answer the question, Lauren? Or
very, very comprehensive. I won't ask any more. Give others a chance. Do you have any consensus around Gavi? Are you familiar with that group?
I'm not familiar with that group, so I wouldn't want to speak to it. But so, happy to follow up afterwards.
Does anybody else have questions? Doesn't seem like it.
Am I allowed to ask another question? It's Michelle.
Sure, go for it. Yep.
David, you talked about the sort of challenge of lack of really good systems for rating of human rights impacts by companies. Amongst all the data that is available to us out there, could you just give us for people who are not familiar with that debate? Could you just give us a little taste of what the issue is there surrounding the human rights ESG ratings?
Sure. There's two pieces to this. There's the tools to evaluate risk in a business relationship, which is broader, and then the ratings that apply to a specific company. When we look at how can a bank think about where its highest risk transactions or relationships are, we're thinking about, we developed some guidance through work with the IFC and then through work with the businesses we work with that help to articulate what are the factors that can create a high risk for severe human rights impacts. Oftentimes, banks will use country, just the country as the number one source of risk. And the problem there is that they don't always know where the operations are taking place of that company. So the company might be headquartered here, but its operations are over there. And over there, it's quite a different situation of contextual risk from where you're operating than where you're headquartered. That's one of the challenges of the gaps in information. A second comes to, and it's not just about the country, it's also applying that country lens to the specific sector and specific types of activities that are being addressed. One of the other challenges is the other thing banks will often do is rate the quality of a company's management systems approach to this. And the problem here is that the ratings tools aren't necessarily measuring the right things, in part because we're still figuring out what to measure to say, are you actually managing human rights well? So for example, some of the tools focus a lot on the exposure in the media, adverse media exposure. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that if I am a large multinational, then I am a target for adverse media exposure. If I am Rio Tinto, then stakeholders are going to try to find ways to criticize me because they know I am listening and they know I care about this. I may also have some very strong human rights management systems in place, which don't mean that impacts aren't going to occur. The question is, how am I going to manage them when they do? And that's one of the fundamental challenges is we are looking at past incidents, past reported incidents, negative media attention, instead of the quality of the systems to prevent and address, the quality of the approach when impacts occur, and a more comprehensive look that looks at companies that may not be top of mind in the public eye, in the public domain, may not have had a lot of things reported about them. And so it's very difficult for a financial institution, including investors, to know where to focus their energy because the tools that we have are looking at a couple of factors that aren't quite right for figuring out where the severe human rights risks are going to be. I'm not sure if I fully answered, Michelle, but I'm happy to go deeper or redirect.
No, that's great. It's very helpful.
So, I mean, that's why, I think initially Schiff saw this big gap in what are companies saying about their human rights performance. And that's where the UNGP's reporting framework came from. It said companies aren't talking about these issues in ways that matter. So here's the framework that's going to help ask the questions that anyone can use, including the company itself, to really get to how is the company doing this in practice. But now what we're recognizing is there's a big gap in how you measure performance, and therefore how you can look at scale across all of these different reports that companies might generate, so that if you have 25 companies in your portfolio, you know which 3 are going to pose the highest risk for human rights impacts because of the nature of their business activities, where they're taking place, and importantly, the quality of the company's approach.
Right.
I always like to bring it, oh, sorry. Did you see my question, Paloma? I always like to bring it down to sort of practical examples. I was just wondering if David had a few that he might share with, throw out some names or that maybe other investors can kind of look at for good practice models.
Examples of what, Lauren?
Yes.
Good bank practices in this area. Like, are there some banks outside of ABN AMRO and ING that are doing a decent job?
And just to quickly, mindful of time, I just would like to add one other question that was raised by Nina, and it's that will we start seeing ratings and rankings of banks with regard to human rights engagement? That's it. So if in the next 3 minutes you could speak to those 2 points, that would be great, and then we'll wrap up the call.
Yeah. So in terms of good practice, I think we see more interesting practices with regard to prioritization and leverage and remedy by looking at analogies from the public financial instrument space. Because of the nature of their public financing, there's a different set of expectations. And so you often see that public financial institutions have pushed beyond the basic E&S frameworks. So development finance institutions. I think about the Export Credit Agency of Norway, GIEC, which has some of the most phenomenal approaches to leverage that you can find that aren't based on the contractual relationship. They're just about trying to figure out, how do I influence this company? So that's one answer, is looking beyond the private banks to look at what can we learn from some of the public financial institutions about really good practice. In terms of other good practices, I think, we're about to see an interesting report from ING, where they're going to talk about their human rights performance in ways that I hope, I've been helping review some drafts, but I think there is a lot of information in there that is typically it has not been disclosed by banks. And I hope that continues to raise the bar. Otherwise, I think our exposure to leading practices is so limited because banks haven't been talking about it in this language. So we are often coming across, interesting approaches to, we know Westpac is doing some really interesting things in Australia, where they're talking about their approach to their bank customers, their retail customers, and looking at lessons learned from retail customer engagement around grievance mechanisms and feedback loops that they can then translate across to others. So I'm sorry, Lauren, I don't have a better answer for you other than to say, we can point to interesting examples of where banks have started to incorporate better screening criteria, better use of leverage, a different kind of focus on remedy, less there, and better disclosure. But they are very limited at this point. It doesn't mean that it's not out there. It just means that, I think there's some work to do to gather those practices. And it's one of the reasons why we want to start to shape up the conversation around banks and human rights around some of these core themes, so that we can start to generate the examples of interesting practice that are out there. I don't remember what the last piece was, the question about from Nino.
Ratings. Yeah, it's whether we're going to start seeing ratings or rankings of banks with regard to.
Yeah. So you won't see that from us per se. You will see us making commentary about the quality of banks' disclosure, which I will say is recognized as different from the quality of the bank's practice in both ways. It's not a perfect match. But what we would hope to see is, and we're working to develop, is creating the raw material for others to create the ratings that they want, but by simply highlighting, if you want to think about understanding whether any company is doing well in managing human rights, these are the far better indicators to be looking for that actually have a correlation to practice and prevention going forward. And if others then choose to use that to do ratings, that they can play with that data as they like. We're more open source. We're just saying, if you're going to measure anything, measure this. What you do with that, but we leave to the market to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Just a quick follow-up to that point. It seems that the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark is actually going to be doing a ranking of banks or financial institutions in 2019. This was something that was confirmed just a few days ago. So more on that, I guess, in a couple of years. Now, I would like to thank David so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been incredibly helpful, David, to really get a sense of the lay of the land and what you see as the opportunities for us to engage, and also to understand what Shift is doing in this area, and the tools and the work that you're really doing to help us really wrap our heads around and begin to address these really difficult issues. So on that note, I just want to let everyone know that we'll be following up from this call by sending both the PowerPoint as well as the recording of the session, as well as links to tools that Shift has developed that really help investors engage with banks on human rights due diligence. So with that, just another big thanks to David, as well as to Michelle and Lauren for really providing their framing comments. And with that, closing the call. Thanks so much, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good talking with you.
Thanks. Bye.
All right.
Bye.